Where Colombia fits in is the possible expansion of fentanyl production in the Western Hemisphere. The next place the U.S. is looking at for security concerns. There are now members of the different cartels kind of doing expeditionary missions into Colombia, figure out, can we fabricate here? Can we use the pharmaceutical industry in Colombia to expand our operations?
Is Xi Jinping the next Pablo Escobar? Well, that might be a stretch, but state-owned Chinese companies are exporting dangerous drugs to the United States in large quantities. To understand why, let's speak with Allison Federica. She's a top analyst at George Friedman's research firm, Geopolitical Futures. I'm Ed D'Agostino, and this is Global Macro Update. Allison, it's good to see you. A volume of exports coming out of China into the West is down considerably, but there's one export that they haven't backed off on, and that's something you wrote about recently, which is fentanyl finding its way from China to North America. Tell me a little bit about that. Is that an official policy, if you will? Is it intended?
It's like cocaine, right? Nobody's going to put that on their official trade list of, hey, we export cocaine, or hey, we export input materials for fentanyl. It's, our second most popular export to Mexico. But what is happening is that all of these chemical input materials from China are coming into Mexico, being synthetically fabricated there, and then exported to the United States, which is a major consumer of this particular drug. There are about 16,000 different companies in China that can produce these byproducts or materials that are used for fentanyl production. Many of them are state-owned enterprises. And if you look at what OFAC in the U.S. Treasury did for sanctions, they did sanction some of these companies, some private, some state enterprises, and also individuals that are tied to these companies. And so while it may not be an official policy, there's no denying that state-owned enterprises in China are involved in the drug trade to Mexico.
So it's not actually coming directly into the U.S. They're shipping it to Mexico and then using cartels? Or does it just get sold to the cartels and then they do what they want with it?
The cartels are very good business managers, entrepreneurs, you name it. So they will be the ones buying the input materials, and they will be the ones fabricating it in Mexico. They have all of the logistical materials that you can imagine for both fabrication and export to the United States well in place. The Sinaloa and Jalisco cartels are the most involved in this, which are pretty familiar names for anybody that's followed cartel activity or cocaine trade coming into the United States. And so what they will do is they will take the input materials, manufacture the pills, and then use their regular logistics networks to sell them in the United States.
Why is the U.S. such a strong market? You were writing that the use of fentanyl isn't that big of a problem in Mexico, but a much bigger problem here. And it's become the number one killer for illegal drugs in this country.
The interesting thing I think about fentanyl is the U.S. has always had higher drug consumption than Mexico or Colombia, say, with cocaine. And you're seeing the same with fentanyl as well. And I think there's a question of availability. And I also think there's a question of, obviously, addiction is an issue, and the pervasiveness. You can, go back and watch your Hulu series of the opioid epidemic and everything from years ago. That also helps explain the consumption patterns now. But with fentanyl, what we're also starting to see is that there is consumption in Colombia and Mexico that is growing, which we did not really see with cocaine. And I attribute that in a large part, you had this national conscience of the cocaine trade being bad. You also had this idea of, especially in Colombia, cocaine contributing to problems of national security. Fentanyl doesn't really have that same level of association yet in Colombia, as well as Mexico. And it's also a lot cheaper. It's a lot cheaper. And so it can be more affordable to larger groups of people. And so you're going to see it being used much differently than cocaine.
And yet you indicated in your article that even though it's so much cheaper on the street to buy as a user, it's a lot more profitable for the seller.
Yes, both of those are true. So you can make a pill for a few cents and sell it for $10, which is still going to be cheaper than what you would get for whatever cocaine you were looking for.
So you brought up Colombia a couple of times. How does Colombia fit into this? If these drugs are shipping into Mexico, how does Colombia fit in?
So Colombia is the next place the U.S. is looking at for security concerns. Obviously, Mexico is the hub right now. And where Colombia fits in is the possible expansion of fentanyl production in the Western Hemisphere. And so there are now members of the different cartels kind of doing expeditionary missions into Colombia to figure out, can we fabricate here? Can we use the pharmaceutical industry in Colombia to expand our operations? This is not too far off from what they've done with cocaine, right? They've already had a lot of these business relationships in place. And so now they're just switching to a different product, different types of consumption. And so that's where Colombia comes in, is because you're seeing a shift in the U.S. being less concerned about cocaine there and more about the fentanyl and the possibility of expansion, as opposed to where it's been recently and focused highly in Mexico.
Is Colombia still the same country, though, politically and oversight-wise, that that was sort of illuminated in the Narcos series, the days of Pablo Escobar? I mean, it seems like a much more stable, lawful country from the outside.
It is. If you were to compare insecurity and issues with governance now, there may be Colombians that disagree with this assessment, but it's not what you saw in the 80s. It's not what you saw in the 90s, right? The civil war with FARC has officially ended. A lot of these groups have been dismantled. There are still remnants of them with frontiers with Venezuela and whatnot that still exist. But this idea of FARC, for example, it's not what it was 20, 30 years ago. The major problem for them is just more organized crime at this point, which is a different sort of issue that they have, because it also involves rural communities and economic development plans. And that's really where Colombia is coming at with all of this. We need some sort of structural economic development plan so that when it comes to combating whatever illicit drug trade they may have ties to, they can offer alternative economic viabilities to the people that are involved, so that you don't have poor people or rural people buying into this trade because it's their means of economic survival.
I've always felt like we've as a country, we've kind of fumbled our relations with South America. Like you would think that they would be better and that we would be better partners in some level. How does this all fit in? China exporting illicit drugs, they're coming to the U.S. China obviously knows we're not going to like that. Is this an opportunity for us to sort of repair relations with that region?
Absolutely. The U.S. has been able up until recently to kind of ignore Latin America and take it for granted, because there was no encroachment really into hemispheric activities as you saw from other places. Now what we're starting to see is, especially what we saw with the economic arrival of China into the region, a large presence of Chinese investment, participation in raw material extraction, ownership of agriculture land, really coming in and having a strong presence in critical parts of the economy. That's why people are afraid of 5G and all of these other things. And so the U.S. has before kind of separated economic and security when they've looked at Latin America, and had this approach before of, well, if China's doing this econ stuff, as long as we still have everything under control with security, we're okay. And now they're realizing that it's becoming a lot more difficult with economic warfare in the last couple of years to separate economics and security into two very different sections. And so what we're starting to see now is, especially with this fentanyl case, the U.S. realizing that their security strategy and their economic strategy in Latin America needs to be more intertwined to address a lot of the security issues that they're going to be concerned about.
It seems like Brazil is pretty adept at walking a line between the U.S. and China. Do you see China making more inroads in Brazil, which is an incredibly important country from rare earths and commodities, agriculture, or do you see Brazil maybe coming closer to the U.S.?
The case of Brazil is interesting because it's almost like in India, if you will. it's big, and it can use that weight just by its sheer size to have a counter both with China and the United States. It has historically and to this day been very clear about not wanting to align too strongly with either one. It's survived this long and taken advantage of its size by not aligning too strongly with any single country. In terms of markets, the economic relationship between Brazil and China is much more based, as you were saying, on raw materials, whereas with the United States, it's a lot more finished goods. So even the nature of trade is going to be a little different. But we are starting to see more competition between those two countries looking for participation in Brazil. That's going to be more a question of what can China bring to the table and what can the U.S. bring to the table than what will Brazil do, because Brazil is going to take the best deal that comes its way.
You're with Geopolitical Futures. You work with George Friedman. I've talked with George many times about his thoughts on China. I would guess I would describe him, if I had to give a brief description, I'd say he's a China bear. What are your thoughts on China and how important is this fentanyl issue to U.S.-China relations? And where do you see U.S.-China relations moving in the future?
So as far as the fentanyl aspect specifically, I think it's more important to the U.S.-Mexico relationship than it is to the U.S.-China relationship.
Okay.
And that's primarily because it's a constant security issue between the U.S. and Mexico. They understand this, and Mexico is heavily constrained by how much it can do with China. It knows the U.S. has a red line when it comes to certain things with security and drug consumption, and the U.S. does not want to see Chinese companies flooding into Mexico. Because then they can take advantage of trade agreements with the U.S. and absorb markets that the U.S. is trying to keep close to China. So I think that's where the fentanyl is coming from, and they're using that as leverage with Mexico to kind of try to keep some of this in line and to scare off China in that regard. China knows that it can't push Mexico with the U.S. As far as the general relationship with China and the U.S. right now, your listeners obviously know things are not going well. And at this point, the domestic problems and constraints that China's facing with unemployment, with younger people, tech crackdowns, debt with municipalities, you name it, they have a weaker hand than the United States at this point because they are in a much weaker position economically. They have a lot more to lose than the U.S., and they are not in a position to make many strong demands.
So the big topic between the U.S. and China lately has been Taiwan. Right now, there's fear that China is going to invade Taiwan, and yet supposedly we, the Americans, have a one China policy, meaning officially we believe that Taiwan is part of China. So why is this even an issue?
You look at how the U.S. behaves in other countries as well. What's on paper and what countries do in practice don't necessarily always align. And
seems like it.
Yeah, there's a lot of different other examples that you can have with that. But with the case with Taiwan, it is a very important economic and technology hub right now for U.S. business with semiconductors, which I'm sure people have been aware of. And it's a thorn in the side for China, which the U.S. is consistently looking for different buttons it can push to debilitate Beijing. And it's in a beautiful location in that it's very sensitive for China, not as sensitive for the United States in terms of proximity, and especially with the moves to expand chip production to other countries, that vulnerability decreases.
There's been some news recently about China having influence really close to our borders in Cuba. Mm-hmm. I personally have always been hopeful that we will establish better relations with Cuba. It's an island that you can see on a clear day from the southernmost part of Florida. It's a beautiful island. I've been there. And the last time I was there, I was with part of a unofficial diplomatic group. We met with the head of planning, the economy. We met with the individual who was in charge of U.S.-Cuba relations. And they were all sort of pleading the same case, which is end the embargo, improve relations, and they made a compelling case. But they weren't willing to change their government structure. That was the one thing they were adamant about. A lot of reasons on both sides for distrust. But I left, this was back in January, I left somewhat hopeful that maybe some progress could be made. And then news comes out recently about China having a listening station, a spying station, essentially, aimed at the U.S. on Cuban ground. What are your thoughts on that?
Quite a few. When I still stand by the idea that with negotiations, China has a weaker hand than the U.S. However, that means China's going to look for those pressure points that it can actually use against the US to better its position. And Cuba is a perfect example where its proximity to the US and the nature of telecommunications and whatnot do potentially pose a threat to US security in terms of monitoring signals in US operations, given how close Cuba is and what you can do with telecommunications these days. And China is very well developed on that front, especially for those intended for espionage purposes. That is also why I think you're seeing the U.S. pay more attention to Cuba over the past couple of years than before. There's a few different reasons. China and others trying to use Cuba as a foothold in the region against the U.S. is definitely a vulnerability that the U.S. needs to address and be careful of. The other is that the economy in Cuba is tanking, which sounds a little silly to say because it's been bad for a long time, but we're getting to whole new levels of dysfunction as opposed to just poverty, which I'm sure you saw.
Certainly did.
Yeah. And what we're seeing from the U.S. is the U.S. has oscillated with its Cuba policy, where it has administrative tools where it can tighten how hard those sanctions are against Cuba, and it can loosen them up in terms of how much money can go in, how much money can come out, how are we going to help people, how are we not going to help people. And you saw that loosen, for example, with the Obama administration. At the end of his administration, he opened up travel a lot, which also brought in a lot of goods and money to Cuba. And then they were tightened again when the U.S. felt that there needed to be security issues addressed in Cuba. So far, Cuba and the U.S. have kind of had this weird dance that you've talked about, which is they both kind of want better ties. Cuba needs it for its economy. The U.S. needs it for security purposes. But that question of regime continuity is still that major sticking point. And so while you see more flights to Cuba, while you see the U.S. helping Cuban entrepreneurs, there's still a huge part of the U.S. strategy that wants to target electronics and social media. And that is something that the Cuban government is animately forcing down. So there is this kind of flirtatious relationship that's going on right now, but that sticking point is still very much alive.
It's a seductive place. So I guess that's why we have a flirtatious relationship with them. It's funny. I spoke with George Friedman before I went, and just said, "What do you think? Should I go on this trip?" And he said, "Absolutely, you should go." But then he laid out what they would do. Here's what's going to happen. They're going to trot out a bunch of entrepreneurs, and they're going to show you how they're like Americans, and they're going to have the entrepreneurs talk about how they go back and forth to the U.S. until we close the borders, and then they're going to talk about the embargo and how it's all on our side. And he was right. He pretty much laid it out exactly how it played out, which I found interesting. How much can the U.S. handle diplomatically? We've got support for Ukraine happening. We've got pressure coming from China, and we're putting pressure on China. There are all these opportunities in South America, in Cuba, in the regions closer to us that we've spoken about today that I really feel like we could be doing better. Is it just that we're spread too thin diplomatically? The
United States is at capacity with its ability to deal with major conflicts. It's just look at the scope of what's going on, and then add to that the economic scenario globally. Countries, I would say, are still in some ways recovering from the pandemic. The global economy is being restructured both in light of the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. Prices of different commodities have been all over the place in the last few years. And there's talk for many major economies, the US, Germany, and others included, of potential recession coming our way. So when you have that, you have an election year in 2024. You have the political pressure to think about the next terms and on governance. You have the economic pressures of keeping your domestic economy afloat and also navigating all of these broader economic questions because you are engaged in economic warfare on various fronts. And then you have the diplomatic and security issues, such as the war in Ukraine, in China, and to a lesser extent, there's still skirmishes going on in the Middle East and chances of a wild card, why people freak out over North Korea and things like that. And so the US, and I would argue quite a few other countries, are at their limits in terms of what they can handle. And I would argue that China is also at its limits of what it can handle, which is why we haven't seen it really come out too strongly in favor of Ukraine. It's kept a good relationship with Russia, but it has not been a diehard supporter. It's done nothing to move the dial of a balance of power in that war by sending any soldiers or significant hardware or technology that moves the needle in that battle. And so I think we're seeing both the US and China at their max right now, both because of what's going on in the world and then the economic and political pressures at home.
If you missed it, check out my interview with author Matt Lewis, who tells us how US politicians have become, in his words, filthy rich.